All right, welcome to the Texas Politics Speaker Series. We are happy to have two unique observers of Texas politics here with us today. Before there were blogs, before there was the Drudge Report, before there was YouTube, RSS feeds, web portals, news aggregators, there was a Quorum Report and there was Texas Weekly. Harvey Kronberg, to my left, publishes, edits, writes for, and speaks for the Quorum Report, one of the staples of political information for professionals in Texas politics, which you can find in its teaser version on the web at www.quorumreport.com. He has edited Quorum Report since 1989 and also contributes regular political commentary on News 8 Austin, as I think Mr. Garza probably noted. Harvey came out of the Plan 2 program in this very college at this very university, so we're always very happy to have him back. Ross Ramsey. Ross Ramsey is the editor and the co-owner of Texas Weekly, another institution in the world of Texas politics, on the web at texasweekly.com. They've very hiply lost the www, I noticed. Yeah. Ross spent 17 years as a professional journalist, not that he isn't still doing that, including stints at the Houston Chronicle and the Dallas Times-Herald. Prior to taking over Texas Weekly, Ross did 28 months of time, call it hard labor, I guess, working for John Sharp at the Texas Comptroller's office. He speaks widely on Texas politics as an older, kind of cheekier bio that I noticed is no longer on the site, said that he speaks for groups with an inability to attract professional entertainment, which I've always loved. I really wish you guys hadn't edited that out, but I think now that he's a soccer coach, he's got to behave. His new bio is much more businesslike, but I hope we'll see a little bit of the cheeky version today. We're going to start with Harvey and Ross each talking for a few minutes about what's interesting in the post-election political landscape in the state. Then we'll open it up a bit less formally, including questions from you all. And we didn't flip a coin, but since you're immediately to my left, you're on the spot first, Harvey. Harvey Kronberg.
Well, thank you. I should mention, by the way, that this is the 25th anniversary of the Quorum Report and the 10th anniversary of us being online. When we first went online, it was dial-up, which means I didn't think anybody in politics would wait for, what is it, a 28K download, but they did. Well, obviously, we just saw one of the most fascinating primaries that I can remember in Texas politics. And rather than go, I'm sure we'll dissect it a little bit as we go down the road, but what it signaled more than anything else was the revival, it looks like, of Democratic fortunes in Texas. So I think what I'll do first is put down, we're kind of at the end of the Republican narrative right now. That's not to say they won't rebuild a new narrative, but the coalition that normally holds the Republicans together, that was created in the days of Ronald Reagan, seems to be, at least right now, terminally tattered. The social conservatives dislike the libertarian conservatives, who dislike the economic conservatives. Nobody's getting along inside the big tent, and the question is whether somebody like John McCain can bring them back out as a unified force. So partially, that's what's going on, is that the Republicans have lost their forward momentum, and for the moment anyway, Democrats are simply running on not being Republicans, and that may be sufficient. If there is a single party, however, that can take these opportunities and blow it, it is the Democratic Party. So this is not an automatic vote of confidence. There are 3 or 4 prizes that are open to the Democrats right now. These are all benchmarks that we'll be looking at over the course of the election cycle. The first is the Texas Supreme Court. The Texas Supreme Court became all Republican earlier in the decade. It was an epic battle between plaintiffs' attorneys and ultimately pro-business interests, home builders, oil and gas interests, insurance companies. And at least for the moment, the home builders and oil and gas and insurance companies won. They took over the court, and it has been about as pro-business an entity as you could come up with. Some would argue that means it's been very anti-consumer. Certainly over the course of the last few months, scandal has become affiliated with the Texas Supreme Court, and we have one justice accused of obstructing justice, of covering up evidence that his wife burned their house down. We have other ethical infractions. We discovered the other day that it's taking them 2 years to, or a year and a half to 2 years to come out with decisions. It is a target of opportunity for Democrats right now, and the Democrats have done something they haven't done heretofore, which is to to nominate people other than plaintiffs' attorneys, which are kind of lightning rods in Texas politics. That's the first prize. The second prize is significant in that it lays the predicate for everything else if we're going to be a two-party state. That is Harris County. Harris County, as you may know, Dallas completely flipped to Democrats 2 years ago. Every contested race inside the county was for Democrats, or went for Democrats. They're trying to replicate that in Harris County, which the greater Houston area is about 5 million votes. We have a mayor there who's looking at potentially running for governor. If Barack Obama is on the ticket, the conventional wisdom is that Harris County is all but assured to flip Democratic. There's a large African American population. It's been trending Democratic. And if you end up with Dallas County and Harris County both going fairly seriously Democratic, then you have a tectonic shift that potentially plays out in 2010 statewide elections, including the governor's race. And the final prize, I don't really believe that the Democrats can win the Texas House, but if they gain a couple of seats, they transform the power structure inside the Texas House, and they undermine Speaker Tom Craddick. And we'll get into that a little bit more, I'm sure, about why that would undermine Speaker Tom Craddick, but that would be a sea change. The first Republican speaker in years, but after redistricting, they had 88 Republicans. They're now down to 79 Republicans. It takes 76 to create a margin. Of those 79 Republicans, probably 10 are what we call ABCs. That means anybody but Craddick. There's Republicans that do not like the speaker and will vote for another Republican or another Democrat, anybody but Craddick. Now, the joke was, as many of these people were Pete Laney supporters, who was a Democratic speaker, and the joke was ABC actually meant already been a chairman, don't need to do that again. But by and large, my guess is if Democrats gain 2, that it changes the texture of the House sufficiently that we will have a pretty much wide open speaker's race. Anybody but Craddick as speaker is gain for Democrats and certainly a gain for the political center, which is the big shift. So those are the 3 targets of opportunity, it seems to me, that are available for Democrats right now. And all of them, if they succeed in any of these, it lays the predicate for potentially competitive statewide campaigns in 2010, which would be the first time since Ann Richards faced off against Clayton Williams, really, that we've got potential for competitive two-party state.
This is one of those things where you sort of start, you can always see these things very clearly in the rearview mirror, and it's hard to say when you're in a recession or when you're in a political change that you're actually in it. But one of the, it's sort of like the thing in the Christmas Carol, you remember we said, Spirit, is this the future that might be or the future that will be? So the future that might be here. 20 years ago, Dallas County went from a classic, straight, Democratic, solid county to a Republican county. 1984, it went boop and just flipped. The only judge who survived that year at the courthouse was a guy who had the same name as the most popular DJ in town, Ron Chapman. And he was the only Democrat who survived in Dallas County politics for a long time. Shortly after that, Harris County began to flip, and the party that was not in power began to make inroads because of scandals on the Texas Supreme Court and in the Texas high courts. And at that time, the first one that they put in was Tom Phillips. They began to win some elections there. Phillips won in his own right in 1988 and broke the Democratic hegemony on the court. And then in 1990, this kind of kept creeping along. In 1986, Bill Clements won again. 1990, the Republicans cracked the middle of the statewide ballot with Rick Perry, who was a sort of backbencher, out of favor House member who had switched parties, and with Kay Hutchison, who had left the House 15 years before and had gone to Dallas and run a candy company and worked for a bank. So she was completely out of politics. She was around it, but she was completely out of ballot politics for a long time. And everybody thought when they got on the ballot, well, you're nuts. You're not going to beat these people. In particular, there was a poll in 1989 that said of all of the statewide officials in Texas, the 2 most popular, the 2 most unbeatable people on the Texas ballot were Senator Phil Gramm and Agriculture Commissioner Jim Hightower. And that season actually began with people talking about whether Hightower would give up the agriculture seat to run against Gramm in 1990. So Rick Perry was considered nuts. That was a throwaway. This is Gallipoli. You're going over the fence here. We all know what happened in 1990. Rick Perry won narrowly. Kay Hutchison won, and the Republicans began to creep in. At the same time, this was starting to happen in the House. They were starting to lose conservative Democrats to moderate Republicans, and the Republicans were starting, you can go back and track, and their numbers begin to increase there. So if you took a wild stab at what's happening now and took that one anecdotal set, we may be in what's a 20-year shift and has been over time, kind of a regular 20-year swing in Texas politics. We're approaching a couple of things that'll make a big difference in this. In the 2010 election, we'll pick the people who are going to draw redistricting maps. And if the Democrats can break in now, start cracking the ballot now, they'll begin to have some leverage on those things. I don't think they'll actually be drawing those maps in 2011, but they'll begin to have some leverage on that. The Senate is locked in until redistricting. There's no way that the Senate's going to change party power. The Democrats may get a little stronger, but those maps are just, they're really strong maps. That district's going to elect a Republican. That district's going to elect a Democrat, and almost no amount of politicking is going to change the Senate around. The House is really close, and I think what you can say about the House, I agree with Harvey, I don't think the Democrats take it this time, but what you can say about the House is that the margin in the House is so narrow that the next speaker, whether it's Tom Craddock or his replacement, is going to be a very short-term speaker. Because I think the guy after that, you're either going to get Tom Craddock on his way out, maybe he'll win this one, maybe he'll win two more, he's very good at this, or you'll get a Democrat or another Republican who's an interim speaker like Rayford Price back in the day. So I think whoever's at the top of the House doesn't get there with a governing majority, and I think they're in a very tenuous situation. It becomes a very hard place to get things done. Some people like that. If you're out to kill bills, it's a very easy place to do it. If you're out to try to start something, it becomes a very, very difficult, even more difficult place to do it. And then there's this weird anomaly this year, this Barack Obama thing. Rick Noriega, Jim and I were talking before we started, that Rick Noriega got into the Senate race as a Democrat. He's a House member. You guys might know him. He's a Texas House member from Houston. He decided to run for United States Senate. And part of the predicate for this was he's running from Houston. That's about 28% of the electorate. And if you look at the past couple of Democratic primaries, the top voting counties aren't the most populated counties in the state. The top three counties are Hidalgo and Cameron and places like that. It's not Harris and Dallas. So they figured he's got an Hispanic name. The only place where he's well known is Houston. This will get him elected as the Democratic nominee pretty easily, and then they'll start from there. Well, something funny happened on the way out of Iowa, and the United States presidential race came here, and all of a sudden the math changed. So what happened in the Democratic primary, among a million other things, is that the counties voted the way they're populated. The top vote came from Harris. The second came from Dallas. The third came from Tarrant. Click, 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 down to a thing like that. Rick Noriega had an unexpectedly very close election. And what that showed, either momentarily or as a trend line, is that if you get Obama on the ticket in November, you have the chance to sort of change the water level in Texas elections. There was Warren Buffett, the investor, does a letter to his stockholders every year, and he was moaning about the mortgage crisis, and he said, what happens is when the water goes out, you can tell who's swimming naked. What happens here is that people are situated so that they're probably not going to win their races unless the water level changes significantly. And you could get an election, I'm not saying you will, but you could get an election here where the water level goes up a little bit, and some of these people who right now we don't think will get elected could get elected. That could tilt the House a little bit. It probably won't tilt the Senate. It'll tilt a couple of congressional races, but it could be very interesting in changing the math in Texas politics. There are 3 or 4 other things that can also change the water level, and then I'll quit talking. I think Obama's the main thing. I think if he's on the ticket in November, there is a chance that we get the same kind of turnout phenomenon or some version of it in November that we got in March. And we get it nationwide, but we're talking really about Texas. I think any kind of new terror attack or something like that could change the water level. All of these change it in different directions. A terror attack probably changes it in favor of Republicans. If it's war that we're talking about, and that becomes the spike that probably benefits or potentially benefits Democrats. If it's the economy, that benefits the party that's not in power, that's Democrats. It's a very uncomfortable year to be an incumbent. We were talking the other day to a group that included Harriet O'Neill, who's on the Texas Supreme Court, and we were talking about what Harvey mentioned, all of these judges in trouble. People don't distinguish between the Texas Supreme Court, Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. So you've got a judge over here. If you're a Democrat running for office, you say you've got a judge over here who let a guy die because she wouldn't take papers after 5 o'clock. You've got a judge over here whose wife is an arson, who tried to bury the evidence on the fire in his house. You've got 3 judges who are using their campaign funds to travel around the state. And you don't have to mention when you're saying all of that none of the people you're talking about are on the ballot. You just say that they're all Republicans, they're all judges, and you try to run that way. So that's a high water race. So I think that's kind of the layout. If it changes when we go by it and we look in our rearview mirror in 6 months and none of this happened, just remember my name is Harvey Kronberg.
That's right. WWW.
Right.
Thanks, guys. That's great. You know, I think we might as well just push on that a little bit in terms of like what's going on in the party system. I mean, you're talking about shifting water levels. I mean, I think for Democratic optimists, there's all this talk that this is, you know, or at least talk that there's a desire for this to be kind of tectonic in a sense and fundamental. You guys see this as something structural? I mean, you talked about sort of the 20-year swings, and you know, there seems to be a kind of sense that change is in the air. You know, but I mean, I think that's very much in the air. I mean, I'm curious how fundamental you think this is and what the determinants of that are.
I do believe the Republican coalition is in tatters right now. I had a lobbyist who probably has never voted for a Democrat in his life tell me several months ago that if Terry Schiavo, opposition to embryonic stem cell research, and teaching, intelligent design as science were the cost of his tax cuts, the cost was too high. And this is somebody who will probably, his eyes will glaze before he can vote for a Democrat. But if John McCain ends up having to pander to the social conservatives, I think that vote is lost. And that's kind of the irony or the problem that John McCain is in right now, and Republicans. Every time he goes out to persuade social conservatives that he's really okay, he's one of their guys, he'll appoint those kinds of judges. He may win a social conservative, but he may also end up losing 1 or 2 economic or libertarian conservatives who are looking for someplace else to go. The fundamental thing, it seems to me, is that in 2000 and 2004, the country really was evenly divided. There was about 45, 47% on both sides, Democrats and Republicans. And both sides realized there was no point trying to win those undecideds because there were too few of them. So they just improved their get out the vote techniques. Well, now in 2008, the center has reemerged. There's probably, by most polling, 20 or 25% of the population that, you know, votes Republican, but can be persuaded this year to vote Democratic or vice versa. And that's the power of an Obama. That's the power of John McCain. I don't think anybody thinks that Hillary Clinton reaches out to independents, but she may end up proving to be more organized or more ruthless or whatever it may be. But ultimately, there is a center that is appearing once again that is up for grabs. And whether Democrats can truly take advantage of it remains to be seen, but it's theirs to take if they can.
It's really interesting. I think McCain and Obama, in their ways, have been crossover candidates and been candidates that appeal to the middle. You know, even if you look at their politics, Obama's quite liberal and McCain's quite conservative. But, you know, there was a Texas Monthly Talks over at KLRU some time ago where John McCain was interviewed by Evan Smith. And my wife and I and a couple of other friends went to this thing, and it was interesting because it was a crowd you would expect at an Austin public television deal. It was a bunch of liberals, right? And they were all on the elevator afterwards going, you know, I could vote for that guy. They really liked him. They really liked that he was talking straight. They liked him in spite of what he said about the war, which is exactly what he's saying about the war now. He was appealing to both sides. I think if you get an Obama-McCain race, I think it's going to be very interesting what happens to people. And, you know, we all know people like this who will enter that race, at least at the beginning, and say, you know, I could go for either one of these guys. I think there's a jump ball in the middle. I think Harvey's right. I think if you get Hillary Clinton, that's more in the mold of a George Bush type of a candidate in the sense that it's an appeal to the base type of candidate.
Thinking inside the state, though, how far down does that drive? I mean, is that being driven Is that striking like shifts that are already going on, or or not? Because it seems to me, talking about even that middle ground, even that kind of shift. I mean, Texas is in a different. It feels to me like it's in a different cycle in terms of partisanship.
We remain red. I mean, it's still a red state, and it's still a conservative state even when they vote Democratic. When we were a Democratic state, they weren't voting for liberals. They were voting for people that would be Republicans in almost any other state. So start there. But to the extent that people vote for party ID or identify or vote against party ID, if this is a race where people come out steaming mad against the Republicans and we change the water level in that way, watch the Harris County Courthouse, like Harvey was saying. Watch the statewide judicial races in Texas. And then in a couple of places, watch Texas, there's a House race here and a House race there. In a couple of those races that I was talking about, when the water level changes, people who wouldn't otherwise win will win. An example of an election like that was in 1994. Bill Clinton had a remarkably horrible midterm election, and Newt Gingrich and the Republicans took over. And I have a friend who's a consultant based in Washington, and he said, this would have been a really interesting election if we'd known we were going to win that many seats, because we would have put really good candidates in there. and he was griping about they won seats where they had placeholder candidates. Dallas County's judge, I think if you go talk to most Democrats privately in Dallas County and say, what do you think about the county judge you elected 2 years ago? They go, we didn't even know his name until he was elected. And a lot of them aren't happy with him now. So you get candidates like that.
The Dallas Morning News, by the way, nobody expected the Democrat to win the county courthouse, the county judgeship in Dallas. The Dallas Morning News, I'm told, did not have a single piece of paper on this guy, whose name I can't remember at the moment. But so he wins that night, and they are furiously Googling his name and going to whatever database they can come up with to try and come up with a story on somebody that came totally out of left field, did not campaign. All he did was put $750 down.
Mr. Gump. Forrest? You said your name was Forrest?
I think there is something significant going on, but it's incremental. In 2001, we did redistricting, and Republicans controlled redistricting that time. Maybe it'll be divided next time. Who knows? But if there is one party that's in charge, what their intention is to draw districts that are so Republican and so Democratic that the November election is irrelevant. The only election that counts is the March primary, when a Republican can only get beat by a more Republican, or a Democrat can only get beat by a more Democratic Democrat. And so that again pushes, that polarizes Congress. And by my calculations, we're probably looking at 5 or 6 House seats now that have so fundamentally changed that they are now legitimately transitional districts. When Tom DeLay came in and we ended up redrawing the map, the congressional maps, those districts were intended to be permanently Republican and permanently Democratic. By my count, we actually have potentially 3 competitive elections, congressional elections this time, which is partially a function of redistricting and partially it's a function of population shifts. Williamson County, you were talking about once upon a time we would look at the southern counties. Hidalgo County would be the biggest Democratic turnout county. When Rick Perry first ran for governor in 2000, they just took the 7 suburban counties, Fort Bend County, Williamson County, Hayes County, Collin County, the 7 suburban counties, and they didn't even try and identify their voters. They just made the assumption that if they could get 70% turnout in those 7 counties, 70% of that 70% would vote for whoever the Republican was. And so they didn't even try and find their voters. They just tried to turn everybody out because they knew that 3 out of 4 would end up voting Republican. Now, the southern end of Williamson County is turning Democratic. The northern end of Hayes County is beginning to transition Democratic. The counties that surround Houston are also beginning to show demographic shifts. In Houston, we have an Asian population that's not on anybody's map as to whether they're Democrats or Republicans. So ultimately, for all of this to come to crystallize, you have to have a voice that brings it all together. And I don't know if there is that voice yet, but all the pieces are there for something significant to change.
Russ, you mentioned the 20-year cycle, and it strikes me that the Republican coalition plateauing is one thing. It seems like being able to identify, we know the cycle is almost certainly going to be shorter than it was if you look at Democratic dominance, just in terms of pure party labels. Mm-hmm. It's hard to know exactly how shortened the cycle is going to be, though. And I don't know, how you would really determine that going in. I think your hindsight thing is
Well, and there's an interesting thing going on inside the Democratic Party is that the Clinton and Obama race in Texas was a sort of an undiscovered cohort fighting the old Democratic machine. I mean, Clinton came in and tapped all the people that she's known since they ran the McGovern race here, and all those people showed up, and you call this guy in the Valley, and you call this guy in El Paso, and you call her over in Dallas, and you call this one over in Houston, and bang, 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 right? Go down the line, check them off, pull the triggers, go. And all of a sudden there's this thing, they're Twittering. What's Twitter? John Edwards was the first candidate I saw in this race who came to Austin and gave everybody the text code, right? Just text this, and then they chased. One of the interesting things, there's a technological difference here. I won't spend much time on this, but if you send a text message to the Clinton campaign, they send you a note that says thank you, and they put you on a mailing list. But there's a technology for chasing people, where you sort of, they send it to you and you hook them, and now you send them all kinds of stuff. The Clinton campaign doesn't use that hook. The Obama campaign uses that hook. And if you text the Clinton campaign, it's active on this level. If you text the Obama campaign, it's active on this level. And they've got this whole cohort of people who've never voted, never played before. All of a sudden, they've got the ground game, which is why they won the caucuses, or winning the caucuses, even though they lost the vote. I mean, it's a very interesting change just in the mechanics of elections in Texas inside the Democratic Party.
Well, I think what that sort of revealed to me was, there was all this talk about the regional difference between the two campaigns, and you could see that clearly in the results. Mm-hmm. But the overlay of that was that there was kind of a shadow Democratic Party out there waiting to be activated, by the right candidate and the right technology.
Actually, what was fascinating was the Obama campaign landed the day after Super Tuesday. I mean, they literally landed in Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, and Austin. Yeah. And by that weekend, they were having classes training field operatives to go out and organize. The Clinton people were still having conference calls with the old McGovern team trying to figure out.
Get Gary Morrow on the phone.
Right.
Well, that's exactly what they did.
Yeah. Well, before you characterized that fight, Ross, as the wave versus the machine, and it seems like the machine barely withheld, right?
Well, actually, the Obama campaign won early voting in Texas by 3 or 3.5 percentage points. The Clinton campaign finally won by 3 or 3.5 percentage points, which means that on election day they had a 6 or 7% margin. And I think a couple of things happened in the Obama campaign. A lot of it was an ad at the end, and the news in the last 4 or 5 days leading up to the election was all negative for Obama, and there were some things like that. But if you just watch the way they turned out to vote in early voting and the way they turned out to vote at the precinct caucuses around the state, the ground game's clearly with the people who've never played before, or with the people who've changed sides. I mean, I'm not saying everybody who voted for Obama was, never been a Democrat before, but they've clearly got the ground game. They've clearly figured this out, and if they can just keep, the news going their way to the extent that they do, keep the former preacher of Trinity Church off the TV, then I think they've got an edge there.
There's been a big argument, by the way, among the professionals as to whether the massive turnout that we had, which was actually just a few 100,000 votes shy of the general election 2 years previous, 4.3 million for the general election, 4.1 million for the primary, which I think is, we've never seen anything like that. There's been a big internal argument as to whether these are new Democratic voters or they're just November voters that became engaged in the primary for the first time. And the statisticians are all arguing, and the exit polls do their thing, but by and large, it seems to me that it's significant enough. Whatever the percentage was, it was a significant enough percentage of new voters to change the dynamic going into November.
And I want to talk a little bit more about that. I want to open it up for questions, though, because I know people have sporting events to go to and things like this. So, questions from the gallery?
I heard someone in Washington say, and this is, I guess, asking you to expand a little bit on your observation, that Hillary Clinton ran a brilliant 1998 campaign.
Right.
While Barack Obama ran a brilliant 2008 or even a 2010 campaign here. And I've always thought that had more than a grain of truth to it. And in fact, I would go farther. I would say she won in spite of her campaign in some ways. For instance, watching her California campaign, this is apropos of the Hispanic community. The California campaign would go into LA and talk to Villaraigosa and lock him down, then he would go out and speak to the Hispanic community and deliver votes. And I think their mentality in Texas was we do the same thing. We go to those areas and we find the local Hispanic leader and we have this long relationship with them and we talk to them. Well, that works in some places. It doesn't work in other places. You go to San Antonio and you say, you know, well, Garcia has endorsed me, and half the city says, yeah, I hate that guy. I like Lopez.
Right. Right.
And it struck me that I actually thought that going to South Texas and spending as much time there as she did was a mistake. I think she won in spite of it. In other words, the growth in Hispanic populations in Harris and in suburban Bear and in suburban Dallas is enormous.
Right.
And I think she won because it was such a loud election, rather than she actually reached out and touched those voters who were key to her coalition. You know, and I think Obama actually picked up a lot of voters in those areas that she left on the table. I did see some evidence that, you know, well, first of all, the exit polls show that she won 65-35 amongst voters who decided in the last 3 days.
Right.
I think that's really what killed him.
Right.
And whether that's because of the specific news cycle or whether he has a systematic trouble of closing the deal, I'm not sure. Right. But I thought that was very interesting. There is some evidence that Bill Clinton's presence in East Texas was extremely valuable for her. And it's kind of
because he wasn't in Houston and Dallas.
Maybe, yeah. But they broke late and ended up going even more heavily for her. So, I mean, I hate attributing causation after the fact, but, you know, well, so I guess it's just my way of saying I'm interested in your observations. If you have anything else to say about your story about the Obama's ability to trap that information with technology, I think is brilliant.
Yeah, they were just thinking about it. I mean, they were ahead of it. I think in the last days of the campaign, there were 3 things that I think the Obama campaign would probably like to take back. He began, if you guys remember this, he began on the Wednesday before the Texas primary an attack, a sort of a light attack on John McCain. And the idea here, I think, was probably to try to position himself so that everybody thought of McCain and Obama as the 2 candidates. So I'm going to position myself here and kind of close her out that way, elbow her out. Well, what happened was McCain came back with exactly the same line of attack that Hillary was already using, and so Obama's now fighting a war on 2 fronts about his experience. Both of them are, you know, they sounded remarkably alike. Then you pile in with the 3 a.m. ad that's gotten famous. It's been on Saturday Night Live, so I guess everybody knows about it. And then if you combine those 2 things between the ad that was on TV and the fight that was going on with McCain, all anybody in the chattering classes like us talked about on TV, in print, everywhere during the last 5 days of that campaign were Obama's experience. Hillary has the upper hand, she's surging, and I think all of that combined to help her out on Election Day.
Yeah, let me feed you guys a softball, I guess. Can you pick out a few House races that you think are going to be really interesting to watch heading into this cycle?
Talking about Texas House.
Texas House, and actually U.S. House is fine too, but Texas House in particular.
I kind of have 2 U.S. House races on my list. Harvey has 3, and actually the third one's kind of interesting. The Nick Lamson race is where Tom DeLay was the incumbent. Nick Lamson, I think, probably goes to Mass every morning and prays that Shelley Sekula Gibbs is the candidate that he gets to run against.
She's the one who Tom DeLay's staff said, we can't deal with this person, and they
she went
walked
to
out.
Washington as a stub candidate. It took the rest of Tom DeLay's term, and the whole staff quit. So, you know, that's the candidate that Lamson wants. Pete Olson's a much better candidate if he gets out of the Republican primary. That's going to be a very interesting race. And I think the San Antonio race between Ciro Rodriguez and former Bexar County, or I guess current Bexar County Commissioner Lyle Larson is going to be a very interesting race. And your third one was...
Well, actually, I guess we have 4 now that are viable. Mike McCall versus Larry Dougherty. McCall has been slow off the gate. This is a district that was designed by Tom DeLay and his friends to represent nobody. It goes from northeast Austin to northwest Houston with a big swath of rural Texas in between. And those districts have absolutely nothing. I mean, the geography at the east end and the west end has nothing in common. It was designed to require massive amounts of money in order to be able to run in 2 major media markets. And he's being challenged by a guy named Larry Dougherty, television judge, who apparently is resonating in a way that I am a little bit mystified about, but seems to have legs and is certainly possible to get national money if McCall continues to look weak. The second one is far more interesting. It's a guy named John Culberson out of West Houston. Culberson is a rock-ribbed, dyed-in-the-wool Republican in the model of Tom DeLay, and if you did a demographic profile, or excuse me, a political profile of that district, you would think he was a perfect match. His high water mark was 80%. In the last election, he only got 59% against a high school debate coach with no money. There's an Asian migration and a Latino migration that's moving into that district. Can Culberson be beat? Well, we've got an environmental engineer who can self-finance the campaigns, already put $400,000, young, attractive, articulate. More importantly, though, there's a guy in Houston who is Bill White, the mayor and potential gubernatorial candidate's political director, named Mustafa Tamiz. Mustafa, Pakistani born, is kind of the perfect guy for Houston, because if you're from Houston, you know that it is a polyglot of cultures that is absolutely fascinating. And what Mustafa's specialty is building cross-ethnic, cross-cultural coalitions to win elections. So he gets the Laotians on the same page as the Salvadorians, on the same page as the Ethiopians, and is able to build this kind of coalition. This is an untapped force. But it is the future, it's the face of the future of Texas. And if he is successful, even if he gets close to beating Culberson, I think that creates part of the roadmap for Bill White to make the challenge against presumptively Kay Bailey Hutchison in 2010.
You guys want to do state house races at all real quick?
Sure. There aren't as many. You know, when you get to the end of a cycle, and by that I mean every 10 years we do redistricting. The first election after redistricting is a bloodbath, because you've redrawn the maps. People are running with voters they've never seen before. That's always a really messy election, and then they get increasingly less dramatic, I guess, by the time you get to the last couple of elections in a cycle. And so we're at the last couple of elections in a cycle. There's a couple in the State House that are interesting, though. There's an open seat near Austin where Robbie Cook was the incumbent. Tim Kleinschmidt is the Republican who's running there. He came very close against Cook last time. It's an open seat now. Donnie Dipple from LaGrange is the Democrat. I think that's going to be that's a toss-up district. That's a good race to watch if you're sort of trying to figure out, is this a Republican year or a Democratic year? Because that could go either way. The race the Republicans most think they're going to win is a race against Juan Garcia in Corpus Christi. He's a former Navy pilot. He was a Harvard classmate of Obama's. He's a Democrat in starkly Republican country, and he beat a flawed candidate last time. A former state rep who used to be a Democrat and is now a Republican is running against him, and the Republicans think they ought to take that race. There's a couple of Austin races I don't think will change, but the Republicans always have them on their map. Donna Howard and Belinda Bolton are both Democrats who've won in what's marginally Republican country. If it's a big Republican year, those are seats that could go that way, but I don't expect them to change much. There's another jump ball up in Round Rock. Mike Crucy was a House member for, I think, 16 years, became very closely associated with the Trans-Texas Corridor to his chagrin, and barely won his last election. He's not going to run for re-election, and that's an open seat. That's another one where if it's a big Democratic year, it should be Republican territory, but the Democrat could win that seat. And I'll give you one more and let Harvey finish off the list. There's a really interesting race in El Paso where this phenomenon that Harvey was talking about of the primaries where you get a Republican who's more Republican than the existing Republican runs, or a Democrat more Democratic than the Democrat. In this case, Pat Haggerty, who's been a House member for a long time, got beat by a guy named Dee Margo. Dee Margo should win this. It's a Republican seat. It's actually the district that I grew up in. It's a Republican area. It includes part of Fort Bliss and El Paso, all these retired generals. They remain fairly conservative, believe it or not. And on the other side, you've got this kid named Joe Moody, whose dad is Bill Moody. He's a El Paso judge. He's well known. He was among the Democrats who ran statewide last time. He was the highest finisher. He had the high water mark. And in this, more specifically, in this Republican House district in El Paso, Texas, where the Republicans were averaging 59 or 60%, Bill Moody got 59% going the other way. His son's running against Dee Margo in that thing. So I think that's going to be a very interesting race.
One of the things that makes you think that this could be a historic year was in the last 2-year cycle, Democrats had the biggest gains in the Texas House they've had in this century. They gained a total of 6 seats, which was landmark, and it wasn't until the dust settled that we all kind of snapped to and said, holy cow. It cut the Republican majority, the spread in half. Republicans think that there's 2 seats that they should take back. One is Juan Garcia down in the Corpus Christi area, a rising star of Democratic politics. He's obviously Hispanic, but hardly looks Hispanic. He's fluent in Spanish. The question is whether Todd Hunter is the guy that's running against him, former House member from that part of the world, and also very attractive. He's going to have a lot of institutional support. That probably is their best shot at taking a seat back. Up in the Metroplex, there's Alan Vaught versus Bill Keffer. Alan Vaught, war hero from Iraq, the Democrat, running against Bill Keffer, very ideological Republican. They're very confident they can take that back. I actually think they won't take it back, but particularly if Obama's on the ticket. Ross mentioned the Kleinschmidt-Dipple race. God, that has a sound to it, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. I remember the Kleinschmidt-Dipple race.
Yeah, we sit around the cooler talking about the Kleinschmidt-Dipple race.
I was young enough to do it. Yes.
Right, yeah.
What is fascinating about that district and a number of them in the Metroplex is that there is a significant African American population that has now been lit up. Dipple, the Democrat, we have to do this with a straight face, Dipple, the Democrat, the thing they were most excited about in their election, when they won their election, was that they won Bastrop, which is where most of the African American population is. And they're pretty convinced that they can get those people to turn back out. When you look at a rural district like that, you think in a competitive election, you should default for the Republican, and probably that is the way it'll work out. But once again, we have a group of voters that have not participated at the level historically that they participated this time, and that could cause a sea change. The same thing faces a guy named Bill Zedler, who originally won his election up in the Metroplex because he opposed a Hooters opening in the neighborhood. Right. And intellectually, he has pretty well stayed within those parameters. And I don't know why I'm drawing blanks on challengers today.
Chris Turner.
Thank you. Chris Turner got, I think,
cards.
Thank you. Chris Turner got twice as many votes in his primary as Edler got in his primary. It is one of those transitional districts. And it's the whole Metroplex, in a sense, the whole Metroplex is going through this transformative thing. But that race, the Zedler-Turner race, may prove to be kind of the paradigm or the metaphor for, once again, middle-class African-American neighborhoods that didn't exist 10 years ago when they redistricted, do now exist in that district, and particularly if Obama's on the ticket, perhaps Zedler can pull a rabbit out of the hat. I had other ones I was going to say, but I backed off. That is a fascinating race, and again, Texas, certainly in our public schools, we're a majority-minority state. Sometime within the next few election cycles, we will be a majority-minority state. The question is whether those constituencies can be activated and whether they hold to their historic Democratic voting patterns.
Yeah, there's 2 more I want to throw in. The Republicans think they should take 2 seats back. One is in Fort Worth. They lost a special election. The current holder now is a guy named Dan Barrett, who won a special election for the seat held by Anna Mowry. And he's running against a pretty popular doctor, Mark Shelton. So I think the Republicans probably flip that seat back. It'll be contested pretty heavily on both sides. And then there's one that stuck in their craw. There was the son of a former mayor of Grand Prairie won narrowly a race last time. His name is Kirk England. He won a narrow race last time as a Republican. Kind of saw what was going on up here, talked to some people, looked at his demographics and said, I think I'm a Democrat. Changed parties. And now the Republicans want to take a crack at him. My hunch is that they got the wrong Republican here, but that it's doable. But that's another race where if it's a Republican year, he could rue his choice. So, but that'll be a heavily contested race just because there are a bunch of Republicans who are sort of institutionally ticked off about that and don't want anybody else to get the idea that changing parties is a good idea.
I wanted to just one quick illustration on this, and the former Anna Mowry seat. This was a special election that was held in November and had a runoff in December. This was a 62 to 64% Republican district. Nobody believed there was any way that the Democrat could win, including the Democrats' consultant. And the Democrats' consultant spent the 2 weeks before the special election, the runoff, saying if we break 45%, he was lobbying me, I'm going to declare this as a victory for Democrats because there's no way we should get 45%. Well, on special, turned out there were some dirty tricks during the first round of voting. And they were tied, they went back to Speaker Craddock or at least were loosely affiliated with Speaker Craddock. And thousands of Republicans didn't show up on the runoff. But because he's been lobbying me for 2 weeks, I go up to this consultant's office and I take a bottle of scotch and say, I'm ready to be spun. Let's just watch the returns together. When the early vote comes in, the Democrat is 500 votes ahead, and that margin never shrinks through the evening. And finally, the biggest, baddest, gnarliest Republican district comes in, and the margin doesn't change. The consultant is I'd kind of describe him as a 6'2", 300-pound guy. You've never seen one of these characters with a glass of scotch doing a Snoopy dance in front of a computer screen. You don't even have to lobby.
Nor do you want to.
So you got Snoopy Dance and the Hooters vote into that segment. Very nice. I think we had a
Texas
question in the back
politics.
from Kathy. No? Norma?
Hello, Norma.
Hey?
I'm a student today. In El Paso, Moody will carry it, I predict. Okay, twice as many voters voted Democratic, and the Republican voters for Haggerty are going to cross over for Moody, for sure. Or not cross over, but vote for Moody. And I'm sure Haggerty will probably campaign on that. So I think it'll go.
For Moody?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I think it'll be D. You'll see that El Paso's more moderate Republican like Haggerty was, and you'll see them come heavily for Moody. That's my prediction.
One of the problems that they've always had, and I'm curious what you think about this, but one of the problems that they've always had running Republicans in that district from Austin is you can't win that district with a Texas Republican. You have to
No.
win with a particular
No.
kind of Republican that's Jack Vowell or Pat
Right.
Haggerty or somebody like that.
And Margot's definitely not Jack Well or Pat Haggerty.
Right.
So, that and the other thing, I've been working on the Obama
And you
campaign.
guys did get rid of Joe Moody's Facebook page, right?
What now?
You guys did get rid of Joe Moody's Facebook page?
His YouTube.
Yeah, this
thingy?
was, yeah.
I don't think they know.
Great moments in politics was, this is going to happen more and more. He had a Facebook page.
Yeah.
And he's 26, so he had all the stuff on a Facebook page that your friends have on Facebook pages, and that doesn't work really well in politics. And it actually had one of my favorite quotes in politics this year was that he finally got into a corner explaining this to the El Paso Times reporter Brandy Grissom, and he said that his only defense that was left was that the photograph of the toilet full of vomit on the page was not his vomit. So it's a great moment in politics.
Yeah, I told him to say that it wasn't vomit at all. It was just a carton of milk and eggs and
Right.
everything mixed up. But and the only other thing, I've been working on the Obama campaign, and I wonder what you all thought on the strategies. Clinton went to El Paso, Hillary, Bill, Chelsea. Bill Clinton went to Abilene, Lubbock, West Texas, and Obama didn't go anywhere west than Dallas or Austin, not anywhere west.
Right.
And I know that the Clinton people, they were targeting the big delegate votes and everything, but the Clinton people, were targeting the twos, and they were accumulating them we all saw the map that came out in the Austin Statesman. I mean, that was a huge amount of votes just because there was no presence. I mean, what do you think, as, political guys, what the impact would have been had they gone to El Paso or someplace West Texas in the middle, somewhere in Sierra Blanca, I guess, where...
Well, El Paso's got this funny thing about, 99% is just showing up. I mean, El Paso's always been solidly Democratic, but George Bush went out there 4 or 5 times and carried El Paso. Waved the flag, I carried El Paso. Well, the subtext of that was Ann Richards didn't go out there, but once, I think, in that election. George Bush went out there 4 times or 5 times. Laura was out there even more times than that. The Obama strategy was work the triangle, the Dallas, San Antonio, Houston triangle, which includes Austin. And if you go back and look at the map just as counties, there's 254 counties in Texas, and I think Obama won 24 of them. So it's, little little spots around the map, but they were very populous counties. And they almost took the state. And I think if they hadn't blown up that last weekend like they did, I think they would have won the overall vote. But looking in the rearview mirror, if you'd gone to El Paso once, and you'd gone to McAllen once, and you'd gone to
Brownsville.
Brownsville.
El Paso organizers were, their territory was from El Paso, West Texas, Lubbock, Amarillo, because one of the organizers said, well, I'm going to drive up to Amarillo and I'll be back tonight. And I said, well, when you get here from Austin, because he was at that strategy meeting, I'll give you a little geography test on Texas.
Right.
And there's no way you're going to drive from El Paso to Amarillo. And be
I'm
back.
in Amarillo, you want to have lunch? No.
It's not California.
Right.
Yeah.
He
And
was
then
probably
the other
from New
thing,
Hampshire.
Right.
I'm an unpledged Democrat, former Craddock D, right? But my thing is, do you think if there's 73 Democrats that it's going to be a Democratic speaker? If the
there's
net
73,
gain,
no, it
Yeah.
has to be a majority, but I do think that if you get 73 Democrats, the current Craddock Ds start to fade away.
yeah, no, but I think that the 73, I don't know how a D goes home and explains not voting for a D speaker.
I
Those
think the
$50,000
Republicans can very easily coalesce around a non-controversial Republican. And that's why I was saying that the next speaker may be an interim speaker. If you get an election where, just let's make up numbers here. If you get an election where the Democrats get 73 and the Republicans get 77, and you get that done in such a way that Craddock can't repeat, then the Republicans will walk in with somebody who can get all the Republican votes.
Yeah, but you can have
And-
Tommy Merritt and some others, Garin, that are, clearly ready for a big change. And I don't think that the conservative Rs that want to do extreme agendas are going to find a moderate enough for them. I really don't.
Oh, no, I don't think the caucuses are going to rule. I think that there's 40 Republicans, maybe 35 Republicans that are solid Craddock Republicans, and then there's 35 that are up for grabs. The 35 that are Craddock Republicans have to have a very conservative person to vote for. Jim Johnson's not going to vote for a moderate. But you've got 35 Republicans, and you've got 60 or 70.
The only time I've ever seen an American legislature elect a speaker from the opposite party was when they had some shenanigans in California and Willie Brown pulled it off. And he's a special case because he's really good at that stuff. And it only lasted for about 4 months. I just don't think I don't think a minority party can elect the speaker from their own party. I think they can elect a speaker. But it'll be
Remember, we
somebody
go
from the
back
other
to
party.
primary politics, and most of these Republican districts, even if they are transitioning, the Republican primary is only 600,000. In a normal Republican primary, it's only 600,000 people. And you've got billionaires who are prepared to make a House primary race a $700,000 or $1 million race.
Right.
And even the stoutest Republican doesn't want to confront that if they don't have to. And finding a moderate centrist Republican gives them cover. So, and it's just easier for Democrats to go back and explain. Anybody would be, from their perspective, an improvement over Speaker Craddock, and
Yeah, they'll say we won.
yeah.
Everybody can, in that situation, everybody will say we won, and they'll be able to sell that.
By the way, one last thing, Ron Kirk. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
Be
Ron
quiet,
Kirk.
Jim.
I can just leave.
Yeah. Ron Kirk, former mayor of Dallas, African American, the Senate candidate that lost to John Cornyn in that first run, agrees that the Obama campaign ceded the field. It wasn't for lack of resources. It wasn't for lack of volunteers. It wasn't. They just thought that they obviously didn't understand Texas, but they also did not believe that Clinton could turn out the border and rural Texas as effectively as she was able to, and. In retrospect, she came in disorganized, they came in overconfident on their strategy, and it created an opportunity, plus some Republican crossover vote to help Hillary. Was it a 91,000 vote margin and a 4.1 million turnout?
I don't know that anybody's really settled on what that number is,
Yeah.
right, actually.
Right.
I want to move on and take one more question from the audience. I just want to confirm something I'm hearing from both of you guys. It seems to me the consensus is that Obama on the national ticket is definitely better for Democrats down ballot.
I think that's right, and it depends, but it's situational. I mean, there's Democrats in conservative areas who are like, if I'm just be blunt. If I'm an East Texas Democrat, I'm a white. They call them WD-40s, white Democrat over 40, and I've got a tough race, and they've got a black guy on the top of my ballot. Some of those guys think that's tough local politics and think that that's just, now the same thing is, if you're in a district that's like that, if there really is a district that's, as like that as they say there is, does it improve your chances much to have a woman at the top of the ticket? One of the lines that chased around Ann Richards in 1990 when we were traveling in East Texas with her was, people would say, I just don't know if we're ready to have a petticoat governor, whatever that means exactly, but it was their reluctance to vote for a female. So if you're one of those people and you're in a district like that, I think you're nervous about the prospects anyway. I think they're a little more nervous about Obama.
And I think
But generally, I think you're right.
Yeah, I think that the WD-40s, most of them don't have very competitive races at this stage. I think Chuck Hobson is probably maybe the
Donnie
most.
Dipple does. He does. I mean, that's that race. That's
Right.
Fair enough. But the anti-Clinton vote is pretty well locked down, and every pollster will tell you that she is a massive anchor, dragging down ballot candidates. But I think if you go to enough Rotary Club meetings and eat enough rubber chickens and do constituent service and take care of your people, that I think most of these rural folks can survive. What's exciting about Obama, purely from a political perspective, is that you've got a half a dozen districts on the Republican side that would not typically be in play,
Right.
that suddenly become in play because you've lit up a constituency that hasn't participated in the kind of numbers that they are likely to participate if Obama's at the top.
It's pretty amazing when you step back in a historical perspective that you could come to the point where you could say, there really is an argument that an African American at the top of the ticket may actually help his party.
in Texas.
It's pretty in Texas. It's pretty amazing.
I heard Frank Rich, the New York Times columnist, had a statistic that he printed, I guess, a month ago that has just still overwhelmed me. 40% of all children born in the United States since 1982 are either African American, Latino, Asian, or the children of mixed marriages. So, and in Texas, it's got to be even bigger than that for obvious reasons. So there's a demographic tidal wave coming, and what is significant about Obama is, of course, it seems that he's activated that constituency in a major way, and that is the grassroots for the 2010, the 2012, the 2014 election, and that demographic only gets bigger. What's 40% today will be 60% in 15 years, and that is just a stunning statistic. Ooh.
Back to the okay, I'm going back to the Obama analysis that you guys went through on the various factors that affected the outcome in the primary in Texas, and you joked, I think, Ross, about the Saturday Night Live had done the 3 a.m. ad, and I've watched a lot more news lately because of the race and been interested in the coverage and the way it's done. And Saturday Night Live also covered the fact that Obama was the darling of the media, and as representatives of the media, how much do you think the media coverage is affecting political outcomes in various ways?
I always start with the position we don't have any effect at all, but then I say, we're powerful. We have a lot of effect, and I go back. I don't know. I mean, I think if you're really paying yeah, exactly. I think if you're really paying attention to these things, you can find stuff out. But I think at any given moment, we tend to cover these things as it's mud wrestling, and that one's on top, that one's on top, that one's on top, and if you have a sustained period where one is winning for, say, the 4 days leading up to the Texas primary, then the other one's going to scream that not only did she have the upper hand, you guys were announcing she had the upper hand, increasing, the amplitude of it. And I think there's some truth to that. I think that happens from time to time. Whenever you have a new candidate running against somebody, Hillary Clinton's a special version of this, but candidates that and who have high negatives, whenever you talk about them, you tend to bring up those negatives. And one of the things you notice in this race is that whenever Bill Clinton comes to the forefront in this race, her numbers go down. So he's like the personification of her negatives, and which was one of the reasons why it was a good idea to send him to East Texas instead of to Dallas and Houston, like I was joking a minute ago. If a candidate like that is getting pressed on that stuff, and it's, you remember the Clintons, you remember the Clintons, you remember the Clintons, and they push back hard enough and get you to concentrate on the other candidate, then not only are you turning sort of the dragon's head goes to Obama and, let's talk about Trinity Church in Chicago, it's not on Hillary anymore, and that helps. I mean, it lets up here On a moment-to-moment basis, I think the media has a great impact. Over the course of a race, over time, it tends to level out, I think. I hope it does.
Over time, but I don't think there's any question Obama got a great ride in the first part of this election.
Right.
Yeah, there's a wonderful episode of the New York or issue of the New York Times that I think really makes the case. There was a 4,000-word story that started on page 1 on Obama. It was a gushing story talking about his ability to bring Republicans and Democrats together in the Illinois legislature, and and how well he was regarded as a superstar in the United States Senate. And then there was a 1,000-word story about John McCain's cancer. And that's probing.
Rising star, dying.
And dying star, right. When it became evident, I mean, it seems to me that it was one of those wonderful ironies. Maureen Dowd had a column the other day where she says, there is statistically no way that you can make an argument that that Clinton can get there right now. She's losing, I mean, she's lost enough delegates, she's losing super delegates. But the power of the Clintons is that you're by sitting there biting your nails, how's she going to do it? The presumption is she's still going to do it.
There are very, very few people ever who could play this hand. And you know, she's actually playing this hand in a way that, you know, you can squint at this thing and win it for her. I mean, she could actually win this thing. It's like she keeps coming back. It's, you know, it's Halloween 7.
But the good news is
over and over and over. She's dead. It's over. She's cooked. Hand comes out of the dirt again. It's amazing.
But the good news is that this fight, I mean, if he does survive this fight, that we all knew that if Obama came out, I mean, he's still relatively untested with the press, and we were going to turn on him. I mean, not Ross and I, but the press as a group.
We have a meeting every Monday morning.
There's a story arc, you know,
Right.
It goes up and down, and he's had incredibly favorable coverage, and then I could promise you this summer that they're going to pound the crap out of him. The Jeremiah Wright thing is a really wonderful thing that's happening right now. I mean, it's a terrible thing, but it's a wonderful thing because winning the presidency is about adaptability and adjustment and money. He hasn't really had to do major adjustments or adaptations or through the course of this campaign. This was a real test. And his initial polling that came out after the endless loop and the forever on Fox News really looked like he'd lost independence.
Right.
And the numbers are coming back up with independence. And I always quote Conan, that which doesn't kill you makes you strong. And I think that if he is the nominee, one of the best things that happened was the press turned on him and the pounding he took over Jeremiah Wright. Because
Conan the German philosopher.
That's right. That's exactly
and
right.
Hooters and the Soupy dances. I've got all of popular culture here.
Oh, yeah. Last question.
I know that you all talked about if Obama and McCain are on the ticket, that it could definitely change some of the water levels here in Texas. Do you see any significant effect of the water levels shifting based on who is in the vice president seat?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the first thing you do when you pick a vice president is you don't want to make a mistake. You don't want Thomas Eagleton. You don't want Dan Quayle. You want
Thomas Eagleton.
Huh?
You might want to explain Thomas Eagleton.
Yeah, Thomas Eagleton was a vice presidential candidate who, after he was on the ballot and after they'd gotten out of the convention, they found out that he'd undergone psychiatric treatment, and
Including shock therapy.
and you know. It was bad. So the first thing you want to do is not make a mistake. And then you have specific things that you have to offset. You know, it used to be that you had to offset geography. So John Kennedy has to get somebody from a big state, and preferably in the South. I'll get Johnson. These guys tend to be more national candidates now, and I think the geography matters a little bit less in choosing somebody. So then there was a moment when you had to go for constituencies, when you had to say, I've run so far to the right that I have to get somebody moderate on the ticket. I'm Ronald Reagan, and even though he's been cussing at me this whole primary, I'm going to put George Bush on the ticket to get the moderate Republicans back in. And then there's the model of, I need somebody to be better than. You know, I'm sort of you know, people think I'm a pushover or something, so I'm going to get a candidate who looks even weaker than I am. And that's my explanation for Dan Quayle. You know, and then you had this almost co-presidency in '92. So there's all these different things that you come to it with. If you're McCain, you've got to have somebody young enough, because everybody looks at you and says, I like this guy, I hope he lives all 4 years, who's number 2? And I think that's going to be a real question. It was something of a question with Reagan. And I think actually as we go through this race, it sounds funny now, but as we go through this race and it's September, we're going to be talking about how old John McCain is. I mean, everybody's going to be saying, well, what if we really did, pull the lever for him? What would happen? So I think his vice president's going to play into that. If it's Obama or Clinton, you've got some offsets there. Is it somebody? If it's Obama, does anybody around here know what's on the other side of the globe? Do we have a world candidate here? Do we have somebody who knows foreign policy, any of that kind of stuff? There's a million questions to answer, and you try to do that with a vice presidential candidate. If you goof, it's going to affect the water levels, and it's because it's going to affect your ticket. If mostly you're just trying not to make a mistake.
Ironically, Ross, I nailed it in a kind of backwards way. That sounds terrible.
Yeah, that was,
Yeah.
Thank you.
I can take it.
Thank you, Harvey.
I'm hurt.
Ross said that candidates typically run so hard to the right that they have to get somebody to kind of validate them back in the center. McCain, ironically, has run so hard to the center that he's got to get somebody to validate him to the right. And that's what I meant.
That's a really the math on that is really tricky though, because I think every time McCain jogs to the right,
he loses the independence.
He hurts himself a little bit.
And,
I think the age factor is huge. I think a lot of these vice presidential choices have actually I don't think have mattered very much in the last several cycles.
And it's hard to
the
see.
age thing is going to be huge. I think this time in ways that it's just beginning. You're just beginning to hear echoes of it.
Right.
Especially if it's a battle over the independents.
Yeah.
And it's Obama versus McCain, then
And if he does go right as a vice presidential candidate, then it's problematic.
If Obama wins, and I'm not, I wouldn't call that race right now. I think at some point or another, I predicted every single Republican who ran would be the presidential nominee. So I'm not going to pick the Democratic race. It's going to be Thompson. It's surely going to be Giuliani. No. Huckabee. That's right. If it's Obama, you've clearly got this youth contrast, and I think that makes it an even harder issue for McCain. And I think his vice presidential candidate is going to be all in that.
Obama has a trap, though, in the sense that he's only been 32 months since he's been in the Illinois legislature, or something like that, 32 or 34 months since he's been a state legislator. It's widely believed, whether true or not, history will judge, but it's widely believed that Dick Cheney hijacked the Bush presidency. And when you have somebody, that's one of the tightropes, if Obama's the nominee, that he has to walk, to have somebody that's strong, but not so strong that anybody thinks that that he could be Cheneyized. But he does need somebody with more experience, some military view. That helps the dynamic. I'm not sure that there's anybody Hillary Clinton is such a well-known commodity one way or the other. Opinions are already formed. I'm not sure what a vice presidential candidate does for her.
One of the arguments is kind of this balance versus, appearance of team. And it seems to me appearance of team is the momentum in some ways. I think with that, I'm going to thank our panelists. Harvey Kronberg, Ross Ramsey, thank you all for coming. Have a good afternoon.